In my last video, I discussed the four main views on the authorship of John's Gospel. Was it written by Lazarus? Was it written by Thomas? Was it written by John the son of Zebedee? Was it written by a different John? And now I want to continue that discussion by discussing some other aspects of the book, such as its date, where was it written, for whom was it written, etc. The earliest possible date for the writing of this Gospel is probably the late 60s, if the author knew of the Gospels of Mark and possibly Matthew, as most suppose today. So the Gospel of Mark is usually dated in the mid to late 60s or possibly the early 70s. And the Gospels of Matthew and Luke are usually dated a little bit after that. Well, that means it is possible that this Gospel could be dated as early as the 60s. A pre-70 date could be argued from the lack of reference to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. It's usually supposed that the reason the destruction of the temple is mentioned so much in Mark or Matthew or Luke is because this event has already taken place whenever the book is written. And so they want to write, hey, Jesus predicted this. In our own time, we can see that the temple has been destroyed and Jesus was right about this. Well, John doesn't discuss the destruction of the temple much, and that may be because he's writing before it's destroyed. The reference to Peter's martyrdom in chapter 21 demands a date after 64 AD. Peter is going to be martyred when he's old. That's what the last chapter of John is going to tell us. And referring to that may be relevant to the audience because they know that Peter has died. And so that would suggest, since Peter dies in 64, that would suggest the gospel was written sometime after that. What is the latest possible date? We established that the earliest possible date is about 65, but what about the latest possible date? Osborne tells us the latest possible date used to be toward the end of the 2nd century. We discussed this a little bit in the last video, how folks got so skeptical in the 19th century that they started dating biblical books really late, and they tried to date the Gospel of John almost to the year 200, so that not only John couldn't have been the writer, but also any eyewitness. It would have been a 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation Christian who is writing it at such a late date. But we have largely fixed this. It is no longer tenable because of the discovery of two papyri, Egerton Papyrus II, containing a fragment of an unknown gospel based on John's gospel and dated 130 to 150. So if we have a gospel that's written between 130 and 150, and it's based on John's gospel, then that means John's gospel has to be earlier than that time period. We also have an early papyrus fragment of John, P52, which is dated between the years 110 and 120. Now, this is the earliest fragment of the New Testament that we have, and it's interesting that it does not vary from our modern Bibles by even a single word, which attests to the remarkable preservation of the New Testament. Now, in John's gospel, for it to be distributed widely enough, because we found this fragment down in Egypt, for it to be in Egypt in the early 2nd century, then that suggests it must have been written sometime in the 1st century. And so scholars, whether they're believers or unbelievers, will now place the Gospel of John at the end of the 1st century. Another reason to believe in the late date, that it was written in the 80s or the 90s, is because of the mentions of being expelled from the synagogue. This phrase, expels from the synagogue, shows up 3 times in John's gospel. And the reason the writer might have cared about this, and the reason the audience might have cared about this, is because Christians were expelled from the synagogues in the year 85. There had been a lot of turbulence between Jewish Christians and Jewish non-Christians leading up to this period. And finally, once you get to the year 85, Christians are formally kicked out of synagogues. And so the reference to being expelled from the synagogue several times in this gospel may reflect things taking place at about the year 85. Tensions with authorities, both Roman and Jewish, may reflect the era of the Emperor Domitian. I discussed this a little bit in the last video, how there are a lot of tensions with Jewish authorities, which have mistakenly caused many to say that this gospel is anti-Semitic. And there are also places where, the author is pitting Jesus over against the emperor, or the kingdom of God over against the kingdom of Rome. And so these kind of tensions may reflect the era of Emperor Domitian, where the church was constantly at loggerheads with the Jews, and also in some parts of the empire at loggerheads with the Roman authorities. So most scholars guess that it was written either in the 80s or the 90s, but I think you'll find that most place it in the 90s, around the time that the book of Revelation was written, somewhere around 96 AD. But where was it written? Well, Irenaeus says, and he's in the 2nd century, he says it's written in Ephesus. And also Eusebius in the 4th century says that this book was written in Ephesus. And there you can see some of the archaeological remains of Ephesus, which are very beautiful. Burge makes an interesting comment. He says the 4th gospel entertains a polemic aimed at the followers of John the Baptist, right? Because some of the followers of John the Baptist did not move on to follow Jesus, and many of the early Christians thought this was strange, and they would run into these followers of John the Baptist, and they'd say, "Man, you didn't get with it. John the Baptist came, and after that, Jesus came, and you were supposed to leave John and start following Jesus." Anyway. Elsewhere in the book of Acts, we learn about Paul encountering followers of John the Baptist with deficient beliefs in Acts 18. Surprisingly, they too are located in Ephesus. So it makes sense that the author would write this gospel, which is a polemic against the followers of John the Baptist who did not move on to follow Jesus. Because the church fathers say that this gospel was written at Ephesus, and Ephesus has all these followers of John the Baptist, and so it makes sense because the followers of John the Baptist are, kind of a staple in this gospel, suggesting that the author is thinking about this, and his audience is thinking about this, likely because they live in a city where John has these followers. We also want to think about the book of Revelation. There are 2 churches in Revelation of the 7 churches that Jesus gives his address at the beginning of that book, where they're having struggles with the Jewish community. It's Philadelphia and Smyrna. And it's interesting that the precise situation presupposed in the 4th gospel, conflict with the synagogue authorities over their identities as Jews. When Christians go to follow Jesus, a lot of folks said, well, then you're no longer Jewish. And the Christian response is, yes, we are. We are the true Jews. As Christians, we inherit the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it's interesting that this was the issue in Philadelphia and Smyrna in the 90s when the book of Revelation was written. Well, Ephesus is really close to these 2 cities, and it has the same issues, suggesting that it was probably written in this same area in this same time, this time of vitriolic relations between the church and the synagogue at the end of the 1st century there in Asia Minor. This brings us to an important question. Was this gospel originally written for Jewish Christians, or was it originally written for Gentile Christians? The debate here is definitely not settled. I'll give you Witherton's arguments that it was written for Gentile Christians, and then after that, I'll give you Craig Keener's arguments that it was written for Jewish Christians. There are 7 cases of translation or explanation of Hebrew or Aramaic terms, some of which, like rabbi or Messiah, must surely have been familiar to even diaspora Jews. So if he's writing for Jewish Christians, why would he have to keep translating basic Hebrew or Aramaic terms, which Jewish people throughout the Roman Empire presumably would have understood, words like rabbi? There are explanations of national and religious customs. For example, in John 2, the jars are explained for the purpose of holding Jewish purification water. John 4 refers to the lack of table fellowship between Jews and Samaritans. And in chapter 19, the burial customs of the Jews are explained. Presumably, Jews that lived in the diaspora in places like Ephesus and around there in Asia Minor and throughout the Mediterranean world, they would have known these things even though they weren't in the land of Israel, which again can be understood if we think of John as writing for the benefit of Gentile Christians who are not so familiar with Jewish things. There are up to 50 possible examples of explanations of localities, times, and events. In chapter 4, it is explained that in order to go the most direct route from Judea to Galilee, one must go through Samaria. Witherington assumes that Jews would know that, and therefore these teachings are for the benefit of a Gentile audience. The repeated reference to the name of the Sea of Tiberias presupposes an audience that, if it knows anything about the geography of the Holy Land, will know Roman designations, not Jewish ones. Now, I would challenge this point. In the last video, we've seen that the reason the sea is called the Sea of Tiberias is because there's this question, who owns the sea, Yahweh or the emperor? And Jesus walks on the sea to show us that Yahweh owns the sea. Nevertheless, you do have some compelling reasons here as why older scholarship and some modern scholars like Witherington still think this gospel was written primarily for a Gentile Christian audience. Most scholars no longer accept that John's audience is mostly Gentile. Now, this is surprising because, this was such a staple of Johannine interpretation for so long, to think that now most of the audience are Jewish Christians. That is really surprising. And one of the reasons for this is Ephesus became a popular center for Jews fleeing from the Jewish revolts in the land of Israel. So many of the Jews may have already lived in Ephesus, or they migrated at that time, and many of these have become Christians. Diaspora Jews, 2 decades after the destruction of the temple, would not know Palestinian customs or geography. And so, the author stops and explains all these things that Jews did in the land of Israel before the destruction of the temple. And people said, oh, that means it was written for Gentiles. No, no, no. If it's written in the 90s and the temple has been destroyed for over 2 decades, well, it might be time to remind or teach people things about, pre-temple Judea that they didn't know. Overwhelming concern with Jewish customs, festivals, beliefs, rabbis, land, etc. suggest a Jewish author and audience. We cannot assume the diaspora Jews would know Hebrew terms like Messiah and Rabbi in the late 1st century. Now, this is important because, Jews all over the world and Jews, in the medieval period, they all know these words. They all know these Hebrew words. And so folks have said, okay, well, how come John's audience wouldn't know them? You have to understand that Judaism in Europe at the time of John in the 1st century is not like Judaism a few centuries later. After John's gospel is written, Judaism will change. It will leave what we call Second Temple Judaism, and it will become Rabbinic Judaism. And in Rabbinic Judaism, Jews start studying Hebrew and reading the Bible in Hebrew much more than they did before. Now, we know that Jewish people in the 1st century throughout Europe, they primarily read the Septuagint. They primarily read the Greek Old Testament. They did not primarily study it in Hebrew. That will come later in the Rabbinic period. So we can't assume that in the 1st century, Jews throughout the diaspora, throughout Europe especially, that they would know all these Hebrew words. They certainly might not have. Inscriptions indicate that most diaspora communities knew little Hebrew Aramaic. 66% of Roman Jewish inscriptions are Greek, 23% are Latin, and about 1% are Hebrew or Aramaic. And so, around the Mediterranean world, Jews did not know much Hebrew. And so when the author explains this Hebrew terminology to his audience, that doesn't make them Gentile. They might just be like most Jews and just sincerely don't know all these Hebrew words. Now, was there a robust redaction process for the Gospel of John? Were there, different sources that got put together? Well, some would say so. Martin and Wright, for example, suggest that internal tensions in the text suggest that the gospel may have been composed over time with multiple hands involved in the process. They give a few examples. In John 3:22, it says that Jesus and his disciples were involved in baptizing. In chapter 4, it says that Jesus himself was not doing the baptizing. Well, they'll say that we have 2 different sources here. We have a source used in John chapter 3 that says they were baptizing, and one in chapter 4 that says Jesus wasn't baptizing, and that the author or authors took these different sources and they spliced them together. In John 16:5, Jesus says, "Not one of you asked me, where are you going?" Yet Peter asked this very question a few chapters earlier. Well, they would suggest that the material in chapter 13 and the material in chapter 16 come from 2 different sources. And when you put them together, these sort of tensions are created. Now, I'll show you as we go that many modern scholars have left this behind. Sometimes these tensions are very superficial. Sometimes they can be explained. It doesn't necessarily mean that the Gospel's based on all these different sources and that the final redactors, the final editors, were not wise enough to smooth out the differences between their sources. But nevertheless, the notion that we have evidence of redaction, it's been around for a long time. It's not as prominent as it used to be, but nevertheless, we still want to pay attention to moments like these and look for possible explanations.